Hi, I'm Karen Abrams, and I'm the Executive Director of Survivors Rising. We're an Omaha-based nonprofit, and our mission is to uplift and amplify the voices of survivors in the post-crisis phases of recovery. And today we're delighted to start our Rise Up in Community series of conversations with a talk between all of us about the intersection of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement and how they connect with the work that we're doing in domestic violence, sexual assault, and related trauma and abuse. So I wanted to just mention the fact that this week, the trial of the former police officer who murdered George Floyd is happening. Uh, and so this conversation is very timely. And I also wanted to mention to everybody here that both the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement were started by Black women. Me Too was actually started back in 2006 by Tarana Burke, excuse me. And the Black Lives Matter movement was started by Alicia Garza, Patrice Khan-Cullors, and Opal Tometi. So there's really some strong Black women at the foundation of these two movements. And what we're going to be talking about today is how they connect and overlap with the work that we're doing here in Omaha. So I wanted to start off by putting the mics in all of your hands to introduce yourselves as the panelists. And we'll have a few questions that we'll be asking all of you to respond to, and then we'll open it up to the group if we have enough time at the end. Or at least you can put your questions and other comments in the comment box as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Candy Jones, the chair of our board. Candy, you can start, please.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to start this series of conversation that is so needed and necessary in our community. So we're excited to have such a dynamic group of speakers. I'm so totally amped about them and just their experience and their brilliance around these topics. So as Karen mentioned, I'm Candy Jones. I'm the board chair. And in this space, I am a survivor. And I would love to talk about just kind of how the intersectionalities of both being a Black woman and a survivor kind of intercede and connect with these two movements. So I'll be sharing from that space. And I'll turn it over to Brad.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. At least it's afternoon in Central Standard Time Zone where we are right here, right now. I am Brad Ekwerekwu. Very happy to be here with you all as well. I'm here representing a group called MADVAC, Men Against Domestic Violence Action Coalition. One of my counterparts, actually the founding CEO, President El Jefe himself is also going to be here that I'll pass it to next, also from MADVAC. But I mean, again, very interested in these topics and speaking with you all on that. So I will save my time and pass it on over to the AM Bobby Brumfield.
Hello, everybody. Appreciate it, Brad. Bobby Brumfield. I am one of the co-founders of Men Against Domestic Violence Action Coalition that Brad just talked about. And we are a volunteer group of men who are working to help spread information about domestic and sexual violence.
Me. Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Hatab. I, too, am a survivor, and I'm excited today to just share what these two movements mean to me and the intersectionalities of them and how they impact me as a Black woman. And I'm just grateful to be part of the discussion today.
Thank you, everybody. So to start off the conversation, I want to bring up the fact that the violence that silences Black bodies and that silences Black stories lives not just in the present moment that we exist in now, but is part of our past as a nation and is going to continue to be part of our future in the historic trauma that continues moving forward into the future. So one of the characteristics of both Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement is that they center Black bodies and they center Black stories. So I wanted to ask you first to think about that fact, and as well as other similarities that you see between these two movements, and how for you these movements are influencing our own work here in Omaha in anti-trauma and anti-abuse. So I'm going to start with you, Candy.
Yeah, you raised some great points. And I think for me, what I think about is the kind of historical context of all of this that would probably take us much longer than an hour to talk through. But I think about how violence really has kind of been the silencer of Black voices and stories for a long time. I mean, our entire history is embedded with violence being the way that we're silenced. So when you think about, sexual exploitation, when you think about racism, it's kind of become like a part of our collective culture as Black folks. And so when you mentioned, the fact that 3 queer Black women were founders of Black Lives Matter, and then the Black woman who founded Me Too, and how a lot of this work tends to forget those voices, that's kind of what I think about when I think about the movement, when I think about historical context, when I think about Survivors Rising and some of the other organizations doing this work. We have to think about really the kind of Black feminist voice has been the power behind social justice for a long time. And so how do we continue to support, the Black voice who's been such a kind of integral part, like just integrated in this work, so, so embedded, but yet often forgotten. So I always think about that and kind of how to make sure we're bringing those voices forward.
Thank you, Candy. And to uplift our other Black female voice, I wanted to ask Marissa, how does this feel to you, that idea of centering Black bodies and Black stories?
Yeah, in preparation for today's discussion, and just doing some reading and so forth to help prepare my thoughts. To your point, Candy, that's exactly where my heart went. My observation, my experience has been, it's been centered not necessarily only on Black bodies. It's typically, when it comes to Black Lives Matters, at least, centered around Black men. It's not typically centered around Black men and women. And when it comes to Me Too, it's also not centered around Black women. We're kind of the bottom of the barrel. We're the last to be mentioned. At least that's been my experience. And surely we absolutely are typically the last to receive empathy. We're typically the last to also to be seen as valid and experts in our own experience. And so for me, when I think of those two movements, I noticed that it was kind of, although we are at the heart of it and we are the ones that typically are very intentional and strategic in sharing our authority and sharing our influence to include the voices and perspectives of others, but we're not necessarily on the receiving end of that. And so a lot of times, although we're the backbone of movements and we're the ones that are really getting things organized and to be done phenomenally well, typically the microphone is not led by us, right? And so I hope that in this discussion we can kind of unpack why that exists, and then maybe some of the things that we can move forward to make sure that as we're discussing both, that Black women voices are amplified. So yeah.
Thank you, Marissa. Bobby, you want to comment?
Yeah, definitely. I was listening to Marissa, and I think, I would have to agree that, especially in the very beginning, it was really the BLM movement was really focused on Black males and the relationship to law enforcement. The Me Too movement, even though it was started by, a Black woman, it took several months for that to even come out because, so many others had taken off running with it. But I do think that there has been a significant change. And I think that the movements have been instrumental in highlighting the efforts of Black women, particularly economically. Black women, people are starting to recognize that Black women are leading the charge in starting businesses. Black women are really starting to be heard. They're kind of the the push for equity and inclusion in the workplace, more and more, I'm starting to hear that being centered around Black women, and rightfully so. But you're absolutely right. It has taken some time, even though both movements were started by Black women. It has taken some time for that to circle around to them. But I think it is happening, and I'm looking forward to seeing how far it can go.
Did you want to say anything, Brad?
No, I'll wait because it'll pertain to, I think, some further discussion.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how you see each of these movements being more or less successful in disrupting systems of oppression and exploitation, white supremacy, rape culture, patriarchy, and exploitation.
So I'll jump in and take a stab at it. I think the question is around how they maybe highlight, or how maybe they bring those issues to the forefront. Yes, absolutely. That was going to kind of be my answer to the first question too, as some of the similarities. They both seem to be centered around an idea, a feeling, cause and effect, consequence, emotion, litigation, personalities, relationships, all of those things that have a set like give and take almost. There's obviously a stimuli and a response. So in those individual experiences, yes, Karen, to your point, a number of other I think harsh, demeaning actions that one can take over another would come into play here. So what about these movements intersects with having one person or one party feeling superior or greater to or more in control of the other? I mean, I think it's right up that alley, right down that avenue. And then the question would be like, well, what are we going to do about it? How do we get the word out? How do we band together? My voice is exactly what it is, or maybe these 10 voices are exactly what they are. But then how do we multiply and expand this reach, and then find others, and then, literally globally have a collective voice that says, now's the time for movement. And I think that's, obviously why we're here today, and obviously why groups like this exist, but more so, how do we move to kind of down that continuum from, hey, now we're all aware of it, now we're educated upon some of the do's and don'ts and some of the facts and myths, then how do we move into a phase of activation or implementation of some kind of change?
Thanks, Brad. Candy, I see you nodding. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, and ending everything that Brad said, but I think also we have to think about kind of why these movements were founded and kind of what their premise, as Brad said, like are based off of, right? So when I think about Me Too and the movement behind that, we know that some of that has been met with disbelief, and people, it lacks, some folks are feeling like it lacks credibility or support, and I feel the same about Black Lives Matter. So I feel like both of these movements lack kind of some of that real belief structure that we need in order to really stay credible and relevant. Because why is it that, and I know I've talked about this with some of you, but on the heels of everything that's happened, these movements are so easily dismissed when it's not a hot and heavy topic. And to me, that is why these movements are so important, that they stay relevant, why we continue to have these conversations, because it's been a year since everything first kind of hit the fan, if I can use that, but yet now things are very quiet. We're not hearing as much, but now it's ramping back up because we have George Floyd's murder and the trial taking place. So I feel like these two movements have that in common. When something happens, we're talking. As long as nothing's happening, we're okay. And I feel like that's why we really need to push the envelope and make sure that we keep these topics in front of us, because it's so easily to be dismissed. It's been that way since both of their inceptions. So we have to do better there.
Thanks, Candy. Marissa, I'm going to pop over to you.
When I was just listening to both Bradley and Candy, I was thinking about some of the demonstrations and the protests and things that happened last year. And I was pregnant and unfortunately was not able to participate in so many. I was like itching to get out there. But anyways, I remember there were some that were very well organized, and then there were some that was not necessarily very well organized. And in the times when there wasn't intentionality in creating common language or common messaging or common bringing people together so that we're all on the same page, so that we know that when we're out here representing Black Lives Matter, or while we're out here protesting, that there's also unity amongst us as we're coming against all of this oppression and resistance and so forth, that sometimes the protests weren't successful because there wasn't intentionality created in those things. And so to your point, Candy, some of the effects, some of the consequences, some of the outcomes that have come from both movements have been happenstance. Some of them weren't intentional. Some of them were like, oh, we noticed this was successful, but we didn't necessarily do that on purpose. But then in other ways, there is a lot of intentionality. And so I guess for me, I was just thinking about the importance of strategically coming up with steps and strategies to ensure that we aren't silenced, to ensure that when things aren't heightened, to your point, Candy, and so much going on, that, oh, we're still taking steps to see transformative and systemic change. And so I think that's really important. And when, like I said, when I was preparing for today, I would say BLM has been at least outwardly better at being strategic, I guess you could say, or taking more intentional steps in that way. And I think that's something that Me Too has realized and observed as well. And so I think that's very important when it comes to continuing the work as well.
Thanks, Marissa. Bobby, did you want to pipe in?
Yeah, real quickly, just to touch on a little bit of what everyone said. You know, Kwame Ture, or mostly known as Stokely Carmichael, talked about mobilization and organization, and I think that there are a handful of people out there that really get it. Going to what Marissa was saying, you have some great organizers out there, and you have some great mobilizers, but they each have, you know, a different goal. And the organizers are really, you know, I'm starting to see, you know, individuals that are actually teaching others how to be organizers, and that's very important. And I would say it's important, you know, going back to the original question, when we're up against white supremacy and white nationalism and those things, is we, in the past, we've confronted these, but when allies and others started getting uncomfortable, we backed off. And I think a lot of the times that we backed off is because we didn't have that set goal that organizers bring to the table. And if we aren't careful, you know, the Me Too movement highlighted a lot of things in the workplace. Black Lives Matter is highlighting things across the board, and you can even add COVID in there, that are really highlighting some serious issues that we have. And if we're not careful about picking who our organizers are and following those organizers, then we're going to lose traction again, and our kids are going to be going through this all over again. I mean, white supremacy should have been stamped out a long time ago, but here we are.
Thanks, Bobby. So I just want to let everybody know that I'm going to ask one more question of the panelists, and then we'll open it up and get some conversation going with some of the folks who are here. So I wanted to also think about the piece that Marissa referred to in terms of thinking more strategically about the kinds of outcomes that we want. And one of the things that I notice that both Me Too and Black Lives Matter have in common is that they really do both demand accountability of those who abuse their power. And so I wanted to ask you, why and how is that particular piece, the accountability piece, important to our work? And what are some of the other strategic solutions that you could see coming out of the juncture of these two movements for the work that we're doing? And Marissa, I will let you go first.
Okay. I guess I want to speak to the accountability piece. When I think about, it's been almost 11 years since I left my abusive marriage. And when I think about everything that was set up not necessarily in my favor as I was trying to figure out how to pick up the broken pieces of my life, how I was trying to advocate for myself in a place that was very unsafe. As far as when I went into the police station, I did not feel very comfortable. I did not feel very safe. I still had all of these emotions and feelings of, am I going to go back? Am wanting to protect my abuser and all these different things. And then to be greeted with just coldness. And then after I gave my report, there was no follow-up. There was no consideration. There was, even when I called to see, is anything going to happen? No one could even find my report. And so when I think about the humanity behind these movements, because the movements are made up of people that are vested in the mission in some way. I'm a part of that, right? My own story, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all of that. That's the embodiment of different aspects of my identity. When I think about what I was presented with lack of care, with lack of empathy, with lack of resources and know-how, to me, that's why accountability is important. Because when people do come forward to want to express themselves and share what they've gone through, and in many times for both movements, it is a matter of life or death for many of us, correct? It's not just lofty ideas and, oh, we need to change because someone could get a boo-boo on their knee. No, like this is a matter of life or death for some of us. And to be just treated with lack of care and the lack of humanity of who we are, I want to speak to that piece. I think that's the why accountability is so important. And as far as how to do that, I want to pass the baton and give other people time to speak to that.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think the thing when I think about accountability, one of the things that comes to my mind is, all right, we need to make sure that there's like a cause and effect, that we're doing all of these things, add this plus this minus this, divided by this, and then there's this equal sign, but nobody really thinks about what's on the other side of that equal sign and be like, hey, is this right? Did this actually come out the way that we wanted it to? Are these results, are these answers, the answers that we want? So I started thinking like, well, what are all these factors that go into doing and doing and doing and doing? And then I think what ends up happening, to Karen's question about strategy and what we can look at, is what ends up happening for me anyway, is that, something big happens and then it, like, not necessarily forget about it, but it like cools off. It's just like an undertone, or it's headline news for like a week or two or three or even more. I mean, the riot, or not the riots, the protest and all that, everybody in the streets happens for like X amount of time. And then it slowly trickles off. And they're like, well, it's, it must be better now. There's no more people in the street, or you don't hear it on your favorite news station anymore. So it must be okay. So I think to combat some of that is and will be the some of these accountability pieces. I want to be able to know that something is going on or pieces are moving forward without having to see pro in the street, on your 10 a.m., 6 p.m. news. You can't, not the barometer. So in my mind, I think to move forward and be active, and I think be strategic about it, is continue to have conversations like this, continue to demand it in every space that you're in, at home, at work, at your places of worship, and your places where you shop and eat and all that kind of stuff. You have, me, I have to be an ambassador or a voice or a continued support, to not only myself, but model those that I may have influence over or influence to. And then those that I see are influential over others. I can continue to hold the conversation out and about with either, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, white against supremacy, against racism, against segregation, inequitable housing, medical. I mean, you go down the list, and all of these things with all of these, more or less oppressed populations, and fight for those identities, fight for every one of those groups, to say that equality is a must. I don't know if y'all have seen Raya and the Last Dragon. I have, or Last Dragon, yeah, Last Dragon. Last Dragon. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. That's why I saw it. So I just saw it yesterday. Took my 2 boys to this movie, and spoiler alert, like, hey, we're fighting for equality. There's a movie that came out in 2021 that's teaching through cartoon and song and all that, talking about equality in a lot of different ways. I mean, I'm sitting there like, what? This movie is ministering to me at this point in time. It's not even about the cool colors or the cool animations. Like, I'm getting ministered in a message of equality right here and right now. Little things like that need to be more prevalent. They need to be more mainstream. And again, we need to have continued conversation and activation around interesting and life-saving topics just like this.
Thanks, Brad. And Bobby, I think I caught you taking some notes there. Did you have something that you wanted to add?
Again, I think they're saying it, perfectly. The word I would use would be implementation. I think that it's very easy to get riled up and get people pumped. But if you're not going to build implementation in there, and that's not just with the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement. That's been one of the issues that has held us back for years. There's no solid implementation. And that's going to come from political leadership, community leadership. It's just going to come across, from across the board. We have to build implementation into all of these activities.
Thanks, Bobby. Candy, I know that you've always got something to say, and I'll let you close out this question before we open it up to our guests.
No pressure. No, everything was so good, so well said, but a couple thoughts, yes, that come to mind. When Bobby was talking, I thought of the song, Talking Loud But Not Saying Nothing, because I feel like a lot of organizations, a lot of people that are saying they want to do this work don't mean it. And again, it goes back to, if I'm visible and it's a moment for visibility, then I'll do it. But when the dust settles and the lights go off, I fade black, I fade away. And that's the part of this work that frustrates me the most, and where I feel like accountability has to be. And so you're right, I echo everything Bobby said around true representation and true work has to be done, and it has to be done consistently, not just when it's hot, not just when it's easy, but consistently. And so I definitely echo that. And then a couple of things that Marissa said and Dr. Brad said too that stuck with me is that as a survivor, I think about when I first began telling my story, and even today, some of those looks of pity, or disbelief or judgment that happen from people. I feel like that same experience happens as a Black woman. So they're interconnected, right? People have this idea around how we're supposed to show up. And I think that's unfair. So when I talk about or think about accountability, I also think about, we have to do better with believing folks, first of all, and showing up for people. We just don't do it enough. We know Black Lives Matter is not just for Black men. We know that. We know, Me Too is for everybody who's been victimized. When Black folks started those movements, they didn't start it for Black folks. I think what people miss is that typically when this work is started, it started for the collective. It starts to become watered down when oppressive behaviors start happening, right? And it start taking over and taking, the results, or taking over the name or the validity of the work. So why do you think Say Her Name became a thing? Right? Because again, we're missing the very large scope and the embodiment of this work by only making it comfortable for people, And one more thing I thought about, and I encourage you to look this up. I read about this maybe a month ago, and I've been trying to research it a little bit, but it was a term called politics of respectability. And it really boils down to how Black women was where this kind of term was coined, but I think it could apply for everyone. It's just around like behaving and acting in a way that's comfortable for people. And so you kind of, like when you protest, that brings judgment. When you speak a certain way, that brings, attitudes. When you bring certain things to light, people get uncomfortable, but it's kind of pushing back, right? And ensuring that we continue these conversations, and people are going to be uncomfortable, but we have to. That's really the only way that, we can really move the needle. And so to sum all of that up, I think the work that you're seeing today, the organizations represented here are really serious about continuing the conversation even after the lights go out. I think we're serious about continuing our activism. And so we need allies, right? We need allies. We need people to support this work genuinely and stand up for this work genuinely so that we can continue pushing these messages. So that's super important.
Great, thank you, Candy. And so now we have an opportunity to hear from some of you who have joined us on the Zoom. And so Nanette is going to be checking if anybody wants to put comments or thoughts into the chat. She'll be checking and we can voice those. And if you've got your cameras on, you can raise your hand. There's also an option down at the bottom in terms of reactions. There's a little mechanical hand that you can raise. So does anybody here have any questions, thoughts, questions for the panelists, or thoughts that you wanted to express? Well,
hi, I'm Jamise with Survivors Rising and Youth Emergency Services. So listening to this conversation, there, like you said, Candace, it's a lot to unpack. And some of the things that come to mind is, and especially in the workplace, when we are trying to become more inclusive and trying to make those changes and acknowledging, the Me Too movement and the BLM movement, is making sure that we don't exploit the trauma that Black men and women have. I think a lot of times, and what I noticed is that in trying to become more inclusive and more diverse and just looking at a lot of these things, as Black men and women, we have experiences that a lot of people don't have. And a lot of time we want to make sure that our agency, I see agencies wanting to make sure a Black or brown face is being shown, but at the same time, I also see a lot of trauma being exploited and wanting Black and brown people to continuously tell their story. And so I think that is something as individuals and as agencies that we really have to look at and make sure that we are being supportive, we're being helpful, but not taking advantage and not exploiting that trauma that a lot of Black and brown people have.
Thanks so much for that, Jamise.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to sort of throw it back to the panelists and see if anybody on the panel wanted to respond to Jamise's concerns.
To it. It makes me think of this conversation I facilitated last year. Well, yeah, last year, it was in June. And I work for Mentor Nebraska. And so we're really big on youth voice and youth choice. And so I'm like, how are we having all these programs and all this stuff and we're not actually creating a platform for them to share their thoughts, how it's impacting them. So I created this panel, and it was a Black youth town hall. So it was centered around Black experiences solely. And we had over 100, probably 150 people who tuned in. But I remember, Jamise, to your point, in preparing the youth for the conversation, I had to bring that up. I mean, I had a responsibility in creating an opportunity for them that they still felt protected, they still felt heard. And knowing I had gone before them to ensure that they're not going to be exploited. And so that came in how I was preparing them in conversation. But then before we even started the panel discussion, then I had a responsibility to communicate that to the audience. And I remember I had a conversation and be very frank, like, these youth are not exhibits in a zoo, right? Like, that's very radical to say, but it's very true. Like, they're not on display for you to go, that is really unfortunate. And then what? And then they're left having to unpack everything they communicated to you. And you're like, okay, la, 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 you go on about your day. And so to Survivors Rising, when it comes to, it's a different name now, and I don't remember it, but Speakers Bureau is what it was used to be called. There was literally intentionality in helping survivors to know how to communicate their story without having to be re-traumatized. And so anyways, I feel like I've gone somewhat on a long tangent, but when you were saying that, I just wanted to say you're 100% correct in saying that, and that we also have a responsibility, and society has a responsibility to check your motives at the door, because our experiences and our trauma is not for you to just, like I said, go, wow, that was really interesting, and then go about your day. That's not fair to those who have been abused, whether it's physically, sexually, so on and so forth, or have been abused by white supremacy.
Thanks, Marissa.
Thanks,
And
Marissa.
anybody else wanted to, Drew, I saw you put your camera on. Does that mean you wanted to say something? All right, go ahead.
Hi, y'all. Thank you for letting me ask this question. I'm Drew. I work with Jamise. I also am a part of a national group that is working on harm reduction in the anti-exploitation movement, more specifically to human trafficking as a whole. But as we know, there's a lot of overlaps in the types of trauma and the oppressors. And one of the comments that I heard from one of the folks that I have been learning from was kind of into Jamise's point, talking about this exploitation in the anti-exploitation movement of survivor leaders and those with lived experience. And I'm curious for my Black ladies in the room, if y'all have noticed that increase because of the fact that there's that double marginal aspect to your identity. If you see that, you're called up to speak or asked to participate and then quickly pushed to the side compared to your white counterparts.
Great question, Drew. Thank you.
Ooh, child.
Exactly.
Here's the real with that. Yes, and I think one of the healing aspects of this work is finding your voice. And I think SR is so instrumental in that, in terms of helping survivors and those who've experienced some of this trauma just find their voice. And it took me, and I'm sure Marissa and anyone else on this call can say, regardless of what space or lane you're in, it takes a while to find that voice and truly understand the way you want to show up and be represented, right? And so when people ask me to a space, and I'll give this advice to those who need it, when people ask me to a space, number one, I check my why, right? Why am I doing this? Because if it's not going to serve me or serve the community, I'm not doing it. So that helps me to feel a little better about what direction this conversation is going to go. So therefore, I'm not in a situation as often where I feel exploited, right? Because I'm in control of what I choose to lend my voice and my grace to. So there's that. And then two, it's the idea of exploitation is so, oh my goodness, it's so much to unpack. Because here's the thing, and I had this conversation with a white coworker not too long ago, and then I'm gonna pass it. When I had this conversation with a white coworker, the white coworker said, well, how are we supposed to learn about what's happening in with oppressive, the country and the nation and Black Lives Matter and all of these things if Black folks are telling us don't come to us? How are we supposed to learn? And so while I'm sure there's a billion answers, what stuck with me, because again, I'm coming from a place of grace. That's where I choose to come from, a spiritual place, right? I said, well, you're right. If someone isn't there to tell you or explain to you or offer you some insight into where you might have gone wrong, you will never learn. You will never learn. And so somebody has to do that. And so you have to decide if that's you. And if it's not, defer to your sis, defer to your cousin, defer to, the mad bag, defer to folks that can support you in this work. Because I think this is community effort, right? So when I'm tired and I need to pass the torch, I'm gonna call Marissa. I'm gonna call Jamise, I'm gonna call Teen, I'm gonna call Marissa, and I'm gonna go, yo, I'm tired. So I need some support here. And so I think we need to lean on each other a lot for that, because the work can't get done if we shut up. But I understand exploitation and I understand feeling used. I do. I get tired, but I do feel like we have to keep talking. Like there's no other way around it. So we just have to lean on each other, educate each other, so that we all feel confident to take on that work. So I hope I answered it. So yeah, it happens, but we got to keep pushing through.
It's all about boundaries. I think that's what I was hearing. It's about having internal boundaries, and also sometimes being willing to communicate your boundaries before they even start. That's one of the most powerful things about facilitation. It's an art form, but in facilitating a conversation, and that is what an interaction is. If you're trying to lead someone to enlightenment, right? If you're sharing your story, your hopes is that the person that you're sharing your story with, if the intent is to inform, is that they're enlightened with something. So I think that's something that is a skill that some people don't realize they need to lead from, and that's boundaries. From the very beginning, communicating, this is what I'm willing to share, this is what I'm not willing to share, and this is why. And then that's when you can have those parameters in place to make sure, to Candy's point, that you're in control. You're willing to share what you can share and what you're not. And that can also help us not get burnt out, because I can be real with you, Drew. Marissa will be the first to be like, I'm sick of you. I'm about to go have 3 seats. And my 3 seats will be for a couple months because I'm burnt out. And so I'm just sharing what I've had to learn being so close to this work is the importance of me living from boundaries, very clear boundaries. And that's helped me. But yes, yes, and yes, that has happened to me. I couldn't even count, truthfully, Drew.
Thanks again, Drew, for that question. And I wanted to open it up again to the folks that are here in the group and see if anybody else has any comments, questions, thoughts that you would like to bring up.
Hey, Karen, I'd like to throw something out there really quick. I like the, Survivors Rising does a great job of giving people the room to make mistakes and learn. And I think that's very important. Um, I know when we first started, I understood a victim or survivor may be angry, may be embarrassed, may be ashamed, but I didn't understand what trauma was. And I think a lot of people that's having these conversations now, particularly white people who are saying, hey, come tell us your story. I think that all this should be opened with like a trauma 101. And if you understand it, I think that may change some attitudes. It'll definitely, it should change some of the requests that you get. But for me, I know I had no idea what I knew what trauma was, but I didn't know what trauma was. If that makes sense. And that goes a long way if we can explain that up front and give people that room to make mistakes. But exploitation is intentional a lot of times, so that may not be the case, that they don't understand trauma. But I think it will go a long way if we did take that extra step in explaining it.
Thanks for that, Bobby. Let me see if anybody on the Facebook page. Aha, okay, so somebody said that was loaded, but Lord. Thanks for your participation in this important discussion. And a question from Aisha Nadal. What role do you see Black African refugees and immigrants playing in the Black Lives Matter movement? And the populations I work with view Black Lives Matter as an issue just for Americans. Some of that probably stems from a very different Black lived experience. Thoughts on that question, please?
That also takes another hour, another 12 hours, another, so I'll take a quick stab, just being, as you all can see my last name, I'm Nigerian. My father's, directly from Nigeria. So as a Nigerian man, there are a lot of different ways in which he is supposed to lead his family. There's a lot of different ways in ways that he's supposed to view his partner, his wife, or the mother of his kids, or his multiple wives. So, thinking that, hearing that, and very specifically just to Nigeria, some other African countries, I think that we have to be aware of these cultures and be aware of the different type of experiences, traumas, interpretations of what happens in America and what it means to be westernized and things like that. I think that, the very easy answer is to be an advocate, is to lend an ear, is to help and assist that person in their personal well-being, whatever their coping mechanism. Can you make sure that it's a healthy one? I always say it leads to life, and life more abundantly, and not necessarily death and destruction. Sometimes you just have to be that advocate. And again, it can be anywhere from just sitting with that person in silence all the way to holding their hand and going off and helping with the resource or a service. And then, in addition to that is being that ambassador, being that voice. And when you see some, say some, step in, all the bystander stuff, all the power and control stuff. I mean, again, we can do class after class and curriculum after curriculum on this stuff, but being an active participant is probably more needed than not right now.
Thanks, Brad. And I'm curious to drill down a little bit into that question of, is BLM and is Me Too for everyone, or does it leave out certain segments of the Black population in the United States?
I'll take a go at it. May or may not get it right, but that's part of this. Here's what I think, and when I think about that, I think again about traditional activism of Black women. And there's a quote, and I'm not going to say it right, but it's basically saying that, you know, Black people have seen like the worst of this country, yet somehow we still believe that it can be okay and that we'll find our best, right? So I don't believe that when Black people or queer women created these movements, that it was necessarily designed with just them in mind, because that's not most of the time how Black feminist women think. We are literally thinking about the collective because we recognize that if it works for us, it will work for all. Because we're the most and the least respected. So we always look at that as kind of the foundation. Like if we can just get people to see us, then maybe the rest of the world will follow suit. So I don't personally believe those movements were created to alienate. I believe they become an alienation when white oppressive folk take it over. But I do not believe those are the way they were created. I don't. And I believe that, you know, I can only speak for myself. When I go to the drawing board around a movement or around a collective or around survivors, not just thinking about Black women, I am thinking about my experience, but I'm thinking about saving them all, right? Like everybody needs this protection. And so I get this so broad. And again, we keep saying we're going to have to do this again because this is really great. But I do think that it's bigger than that. And I don't think any of these movements were created to alienate. I just don't believe that. I believe it became that, but it wasn't because Black women did it.
Thanks, Candy. Your sound is breaking up a little bit. We also got a question from Kylie in the chat. It's almost 1 p.m., but I did want to address her question because she's here in the room with us. And she asks, even though it's a pretty broad question, does anybody have any perspectives on the intersectionality between these movements and the LGBTQ plus community, specifically around Black trans women?
Good. I was just going to say, I want to recognize and honor International Transgender Day of Visibility today and recognize that trans women are also a forgotten part of this narrative. So I think my quality is kind of acting up again. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's all interconnected, and I think we should recognize that. And we've talked about that, you know, so I think as we continue to do this work, we'll continue to bring those voices to the table. That's part of the reason we're doing this. So that's my short answer before my sound goes out again.
All right, I think this is going to be the beginning of a series of conversations like this, and I'm so excited that we've taken this step today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I just wanted to let everybody know that, again, you can keep track of what's happening at Survivors Rising by checking out our Facebook page at Survivors Rising Now. And you can also email me at survivorsrisinginfo@gmail.com. And that will, you know, any email that comes into that address will go to whoever you want, Candy, Jamise, and we'll pass along to Marissa, Bradley, of course, anybody who's been here, and Nanette, and all of the others that have participated today. So we've also recorded this session, so we'll have it available for future viewing. And if people are interested, we can make sure that you get it to it from our YouTube site. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm going to just let Candy close out since this is her baby.
All of our babies. Just thank you all so much for coming, for participating in this conversation. Amazing panel, amazing work. We'll do more, so stay tuned.